Across 4 years of the bloodiest war this country has ever fought, through mud and smoke and the screaming wreckage of the Western theater, he never lost, not once. He secured victories when the Union's survival was balanced on a knife's edge. He stood immovable when the men around him crumbled into panic. He eventually dismantled the Confederate Army so thoroughly that it ceased to exist as a functional fighting force. In every engagement he led, in every sector he was assigned to defend, on every square inch of earth he was ordered to hold, he walked away as the victor. His name was George Henry Thomas, and almost no one knows it. That gap between what the military record proves and what the national memory recalls is no accident of time. It was a verdict rendered not on the smoke-filled battlefields, where Thomas was unbeatable, but in the sterile halls of politics and the ruthless arena where historical narratives get made. Ulysses S. Grant became president and solidified his legend. William Tecumseh Sherman published his memoirs early, seizing the chance to shape the war's story before anyone else could contest it. Philip Sheridan lived into old age, polishing his reputation constantly. George Thomas died in 1870, barely 5 years after the guns fell silent, before he could write a single word in his own defense. He left behind almost no personal letters or private diaries. He had no political machine in Washington to champion his legacy. He was a Virginia-born officer who had chosen the Union, a decision that ensured the South would brand him a traitor, while the North would forever view him with a cold, unspoken suspicion it never quite named. He fell through the cracks of a country that preferred its heroes to come from somewhere less complicated. This is the story of George Thomas, the general who never lost. He was born on July 31, 1816, in Southampton County, Virginia, the third of 9 children in a farming family with modest land and a modest number of enslaved people. Southampton County in 1816 was quiet and unremarkable, but it would not stay that way. When Thomas was 15, in August of 1831, Nat Turner led his uprising through that very county, moving farm to farm over 2 bloody days, killing 55 white Virginians before the rebellion was crushed with savage retaliatory force. The Thomas family fled. His mother and sisters hid in the woods while the county burned around them. George was old enough to understand what was happening and young enough for it to brand itself into his memory in ways that don't fully fade. What he truly thought about that uprising, or the institution that sparked it, remains a mystery. Thomas was not a man given to public self-reflection. He left almost no record of his private thoughts on anything. He entered West Point at 20, graduating 12th in the class of 1840, and was commissioned into the artillery. His instructors described him as methodical, preternaturally calm, and constitutionally immune to the theatrical self-promotion that a certain breed of officer cultivated even in peacetime. He was not a cold man. The soldiers who served under him developed a loyalty that bordered on the religious. But he had no use for performance. He believed in preparation, in knowing the ground, in moving only when the conditions were genuinely right. This consistency, maintained across decades and under every kind of commander, was often mistaken for timidity. It was the opposite of timidity. It was the supreme confidence of a professional who knew that a battle fought on bad terms costs more than the time it takes to get the terms right. His service in the Second Seminole War in Florida offered little chance for distinction. The conflict was chaotic and grinding. Mexico was different. Under Zachary Taylor at Monterey in 1846, Thomas held his artillery section under direct fire long enough that Taylor personally noticed him, earning a brevet promotion. 4 months later at Buena Vista, he served under Captain Braxton Bragg, the same Braxton Bragg he would one day face across the battlefield at Chickamauga, and held his guns against a massive cavalry charge so effectively that he received a second brevet. He came back from Mexico as a man recognized by the senior officer class for his precision. Not a lucky general, a man who read a situation with surgical clarity and responded with violence at exactly the right moment. He spent most of the 1850s teaching artillery and cavalry tactics at West Point, a decade biographers tend to skip, but one that matters enormously. He was not merely a classroom instructor. He was thinking continuously and rigorously about how armies move, how different branches interact on broken ground, how a commander deploys force for maximum effect rather than maximum drama. When the war came, he would know things about the mechanics of battle that many of his contemporaries had to learn at enormous human cost. In 1860, while on patrol in Texas, he was wounded in the face by an Apache arrow. He was still recovering when the Union began to dissolve. For every Southern-born officer, the winter of 1860-1861 brought a crisis of the soul. Thomas was a Virginian with deep roots in his soil. Braxton Bragg was going Confederate. Robert E. Lee was going Confederate. Joseph Johnston, P.G.T. Beauregard, A.P. Hill. The list of Virginia-born officers leaving the Union ran on, and everyone who knew Thomas assumed his name would eventually appear on it. It didn't. In a brief, unsentimental letter to his family, he stated simply that he had considered his position and chosen to honor the oath he had taken to the United States when he was commissioned. That was the entirety of his public explanation. He never elaborated. He never delivered a speech about loyalty or principle. He had made his decision, and he intended to live with it. The consequences were total. His 3 surviving sisters viewed the choice as a betrayal so complete it required a physical response. They turned his portrait to face the wall in the family home. They refused to speak his name. When he died, they declined to attend his funeral. They did not write to him, and he did not write to them for the rest of his life. The estrangement was absolute. Whatever it cost him, he bore the weight of it in silence. Assigned to the Western Theater, Thomas found himself in the region where the war would ultimately be decided, though Washington remained fixated on the Eastern Front. His first independent command came at Mill Springs, Kentucky in January 1862. It was the first significant Union victory in the West. Thomas won it through a blend of logistical patience and tactical aggression, trapping the Confederate commander Felix Zollicoffer against a rain-swollen Cumberland River, a strategic blunder of the First Order. When Zollicoffer rode by accident into Union lines in the fog and was shot at close range, the Confederate command structure came apart. Their army broke, fled south, and abandoned its artillery, its wagons, and its organized existence. Washington received the news with something approaching disbelief. The war was 7 months old and victories were scarce. Mill Springs was not a partial success. The Union had cleared eastern Kentucky in a single engagement. Thomas was promoted to Major General and began, quietly, to build a reputation that would grow steadily over the next 3 years, even as louder generals attracted more of the public's attention. He served reliably under Don Carlos Buell through the spring and summer of 1862, doing the unglamorous work that armies require between their headline engagements, managing logistics, consolidating positions, preparing for operations that kept getting postponed. He was being competent, which, in military life, is almost always invisible until the moment it becomes the only thing standing between an army and disaster. That moment came at Chickamauga. The Battle of Chickamauga, fought in September 1863 in the dense second-growth timber of northwestern Georgia, was among the most chaotic engagements of the entire war. On the second day, a catastrophic error by Union Commander William Rosecrans, ordering a division pulled from the line to fill a gap that didn't exist, created the very gap it was meant to close. James Longstreet's corps poured through the hole and drove the entire Union right from the field. Rosecrans fled toward Chattanooga. His chief of staff fled. Corps commanders fled. The Army of the Cumberland was disintegrating in a rout that looked to anyone watching it like the complete destruction of a Union force. Thomas was on the left, where the line had held. When the roaring sound of Longstreet's assault reached him from the wrong direction, he did not retreat. He pulled his corps back to Snodgrass Hill, a low wooded ridge that was the only ground on the field with real defensive value, and told his men they were going to stay there. Longstreet hurled wave after wave of victorious Confederates against the position all afternoon. Thomas held each one. His ammunition ran dangerously low. Couriers brought him news that his commanding general had already abandoned the field. He absorbed that information and continued holding the hill. He held until dark, then withdrew his command in perfect order, covering the retreat of an army that would have been annihilated without him. The name his soldiers gave him after that day, the Rock of Chickamauga, was not a marketing invention. It came from men who had watched him stand on that hill for 5 hours while everything else broke, and it stuck because it was accurate. Grant was given command of the Western Theater and came to Chattanooga personally. He gave Thomas command of the Army of the Cumberland, though it was common knowledge that Grant preferred Sherman, men who moved fast and accepted the costs of moving fast. Thomas was given the army because the army had already given itself to him. At Chattanooga in November 1863, Grant's plan assigned Thomas's men a limited role, a demonstration against the base of Missionary Ridge designed to hold the Confederate center while Sherman's flanking attack did the real work. Sherman stalled. The flanks failed. Grant ordered Thomas's men into the rifle pits at the base of the ridge as a fallback measure. They took the pits in minutes, found them completely untenable. The Confederates on the ridge above could fire directly down into them, and without a single order from any commander of any rank, they started climbing. Grant reportedly demanded to know who had given the order. No one had. The Army of the Cumberland, half-starved after 2 months under siege, decided on its own that it was going to take the ridge. It did. Braxton Bragg's army, watching the blue wave come up the slope in the failing light, broke and fled south into Georgia. Thomas stood and watched in silence. He was not a man who celebrated. The 1864 Atlanta campaign put Thomas back under Sherman, precisely where Grant wanted him, contributing his considerable capabilities without accumulating the kind of independent reputation that might complicate the command structure. Thomas commanded the largest single army in Sherman's force, roughly 60,000 men, and fought them steadily and well through 100 miles of North Georgia. When Jefferson Davis replaced the methodical Joseph Johnston with the aggressive John Bell Hood in July 1864, the character of the campaign shifted overnight. 3 days after taking command, Hood attacked Thomas's Army of the Cumberland at Peachtree Creek on July 20th. Thomas had anticipated it. He had spent the previous 48 hours pushing his corps commanders to close every gap in the advancing line, sensing that a new Confederate commander with something to prove would come at them fast. When Hood's assault hit, it landed against a prepared position with no exposed flanks and nothing to exploit. The battle lasted 3 hours. The Confederates lost nearly 5,000 men. Thomas lost fewer than 2,000. It was not a close contest. Atlanta fell in September. Sherman marched to the sea. Hood, commanding the shattered remnant of what had been the Confederate Army of Tennessee, turned north in what can only be described as strategic desperation dressed up as boldness. What he was actually doing was marching his diminished army north to meet George Thomas. Thomas was sent back to Nashville in October to organize the defense of Tennessee. What he found was not encouraging. Forces scattered across the state in garrisons and outposts, much of the cavalry exhausted and undermounted from months of hard campaigning. He refused to attack until he had properly remounted and trained his troopers. From Virginia, Grant interpreted this preparation as hesitation. He understood in the abstract that Thomas won. The record was there and it was unambiguous. But the patience that produced those victories grated against everything in Grant's instincts. Grant moved fast, accepted losses, trusted momentum. Thomas moved when he was ready, and not a day before. In the second week of December, with Hood's army sitting in front of Nashville and Grant's dispatches getting sharper by the day, an ice storm coated every road and hillside in a layer that made cavalry movement functionally impossible. Thomas reported this and explained he would attack when the ice melted. Grant drafted orders relieving Thomas of command and replacing him with John Schofield. His chief of staff talked him out of sending them. Grant then dispatched General John Logan to travel to Nashville and relieve Thomas in person. Logan was already on his way west when the temperature rose on December 14th. On December 15th, Thomas attacked. What happened over the next 2 days was unlike anything else in the war. Thomas had spent 6 weeks preparing an offensive designed not merely to defeat Hood, but to destroy him, to pursue so aggressively after breaking the Confederate line that the Army of Tennessee could never reconstitute itself as a fighting force. He swung James Wilson's newly remounted cavalry around Hood's left while infantry hammered the front. Hood's left collapsed on the first day. The Confederate Army pulled back to a shorter line. On December 16th, Thomas hit the new line before Hood had time to properly organize it. Wilson's cavalry struck from behind simultaneously with a massive infantry assault from the front. The Confederate position didn't bend, it shattered. Men threw down their rifles and ran. Units dissolved in place. The retreat south became a rout, and Wilson's cavalry pursued for miles through rain and mud, capturing prisoners in the thousands. The Army of Tennessee had gone north with roughly 30,000 men. It came back as something closer to an armed mob that would take months to reorganize, and, in the practical sense, never would. George Thomas had not merely defeated a Confederate army, he had destroyed one, permanently, something no Union general had managed before him. Grant's congratulatory telegram was notably cold. He recommended Thomas for promotion to Major General in the regular army, the highest rank then available, but the tone of his correspondence made clear that the 6 weeks of preparation had not been forgiven, only rendered moot by the result. Logan, en route to relieve Thomas when the battle began, quietly turned around and went home. The war ended the following April. Thomas administered Reconstruction in the South with the same uncompromising integrity he had shown in war, arguing that the political and economic structures of the old Confederacy needed genuine transformation, not cosmetic adjustment, to protect the rights of freedmen. He expressed these views directly to anyone who asked. He was not working an angle. He never had been. In the Washington of 1865 and 1866, that was a form of professional self-destruction. Grant became General of the Army, then President. Sherman rose behind him. Sheridan rose behind Sherman. The inner circle that had formed around Grant during the war calcified into the structure of the post-war military and determined every major appointment for 2 decades. Thomas was not in that circle and had never sought entry to it. In 1875, Sherman published his Memoirs and managed the Atlanta campaign in a way that reduced Thomas's contributions to a supporting role, elevating Sherman's own movements to the center of the story. It was skillfully done, not a lie exactly, more a careful arrangement of emphasis. Thomas was not alive to contest it. He had died on March 28, 1870, in San Francisco at 53 years old, of a stroke that came on while he was at his desk drafting a written rebuttal to the reports that sought to diminish his record. He did not finish the rebuttal. He left it incomplete on his desk. His body was returned east and buried in Troy, New York, in his wife's family plot. His sisters in Virginia did not travel to the funeral. His portrait still hung turned to the wall in a Southampton County home where he had grown up. What gets remembered in a war like that one depends only partly on what actually happened. It depends on who writes first, on who has political allies in the right places, on whether the general in question lived long enough to cultivate the correspondents and biographers who manufacture reputation in the decades after a war ends. Thomas failed on every one of those counts. He died early. He left almost no personal papers. He was a Virginian in the Union Army, a man who fit nowhere in the simplified stories of the lost cause or the victorious North. There is a photograph of Thomas from the mid-1960s. He is seated in uniform, his thick gray beard trimmed with precision, his expression entirely composed. He looks like a man who has made peace with his choices and requires no validation from the viewer. No angle of the jaw designed for the camera, no performance, just the unhurried patience of a man who had already passed his greatest test in the spring of 1861 and understood that whatever came after, however hard it got, would never be as hard as that first choice. He chose right. He won every fight. He was forgotten anyway. But the military record is a stubborn thing, indifferent to political narrative or which way a portrait hangs on a wall. Across 4 years of a war that killed more Americans than every other conflict in the nation's history combined, one general went undefeated. He held every position he was given, won every battle he commanded, and destroyed a Confederate army so completely it never posed a serious military threat again. Not Grant, Not Sherman, not the celebrated Confederate generals, all of whose records contain losses alongside their victories. George Henry Thomas. Every battle, every time. The name deserves to be said out loud and kept there.